Most people think they know the darkest killers in history: Bundy, Dahmer, Jack the Ripper. But here's the truth. Some of the most terrifying predators aren't the ones etched into headlines. They're the ones history nearly forgot. In South Africa, a man used the promise of jobs to lure women to their deaths, leaving a nation already in turmoil, gripped by fear. In Eastern Europe, a wealthy widow poisoned husband after husband, lover after lover, until her cellar became a private cemetery. And in Germany, a reclusive drunk haunted smoky bars, targeting women no one would miss, hiding their remains inside his filthy apartment until a fire revealed the horror within. These are 3 killers you've likely never heard of, but after today their names will haunt you. Tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because these are stories you won't forget. In the mid-1990s, as South Africa staggered through the fragile transition out of apartheid and into a new era of democracy, a wave of murders swept through Johannesburg, Boksburg, and Cleveland that left an entire nation terrified. At first, the deaths seemed random. Women found in fields or abandoned buildings, strangled and left in positions that suggested both cruelty and indifference. But as the body count rose, the pattern became undeniable. Someone was hunting women in broad daylight, luring them with promises of work, then killing them and discarding them like forgotten objects. That someone was Moses Sithole, later branded by the press as the ABC Killer, a reference to the 3 towns where many of his victims were discovered. Sithole did not stalk in darkness or strike from the shadows like the killers in horror stories. Instead, he operated in plain sight, taking advantage of a country already fractured by unemployment, poverty, and desperation. He posed as a man offering jobs, a respectable figure in a time when work meant survival. Women who were struggling, hopeful for an income, would follow him to supposed offices or factories, only to find themselves led into isolation. There, Sithole would reveal his true face, strangling them with ropes, belts, or even their own clothing, his killings executed with cold precision. What made him especially terrifying was his ability to blend into the chaos of South Africa's urban sprawl. In the mid-1990s, the police force was overwhelmed, restructuring in the wake of political transition, and communication between regions was poor. Sithole exploited this void. For months, bodies surfaced at an alarming rate, yet the authorities failed to connect them quickly enough to stop him. Communities whispered of a phantom killer, some believing the violence was linked to political unrest, others thinking it was the work of gangs. In reality, it was the work of one man who understood how invisible women could become in a city drowning in instability. Between 1994 and 1995, Sithole murdered dozens, with official counts placing the number at 38 women, though some investigators believed the true figure was far higher. His victims were not faceless strangers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, each one leaving behind families shattered by grief. The brutality of his crimes was amplified by the betrayal. He offered them hope, then delivered death. South Africa, still trying to build a future from the ashes of apartheid, now faced a nightmare within its own streets, a reminder that even in moments of renewal, darkness can thrive. As the bodies continued to surface across Johannesburg, Boksburg, and Cleveland, the mounting horror forced South Africa's newly unified police force to confront a truth they had long resisted. The killings were not random acts of violence, but the calculated work of a single predator. Each discovery carried the same hallmarks: women lured with promises of jobs, strangled with belts, ropes, or their own clothing, and abandoned in fields, warehouses, or patches of scrubland. The press began referring to the unknown killer as the ABC murderer, naming him after the 3 key areas where victims were being found. For a country already burdened by social unrest, political transition and economic hardship, the idea that a serial killer was moving with impunity in broad daylight ignited public fear. Rumors swirled through townships and inner cities, mothers warning daughters not to travel alone, women clutching newspapers with headlines that described another body discovered, another family mourning. Police scrambled to form a task force, but they faced daunting challenges. Forensic resources were limited, communication between regions was poor, and investigators were under immense pressure from politicians desperate to prove that the new South Africa could protect its citizens. At first, authorities struggled to make progress. Witness accounts were scattered, some describing a man who seemed polite and professional, offering women jobs in child care centers or offices, others recalling only vague impressions of his voice or clothing. But slowly, a picture began to form. Several survivors, women who had managed to escape Scythole's lure, came forward. They described how he approached them with the promise of employment, often carrying fake documents or leading them towards supposed interview sites. When they grew suspicious or resisted, his charm evaporated, replaced by sudden aggression. From these testimonies, police built a psychological profile. The killer was confident, organized, and careful in his selection, someone who knew how to exploit desperation without drawing immediate suspicion. The task force began to monitor areas where job seekers gathered, posting warnings in newspapers and urging women not to trust strangers with offers of work. Yet despite these efforts, Scythole continued killing, his victims piling up even as his description circulated more widely. The breakthrough came when a woman identified him by name, recognizing Moses Scythole as the man who had offered her a job shortly before she narrowly escaped his advances. Further investigation revealed that Scythole had a prior criminal history, including charges of rape, and had spent time in prison before his killing spree began. This discovery tightened the net around him, but it also revealed something more disturbing. Scythole had learned from his time behind bars, refining his methods, becoming more cautious, and honing his ability to manipulate. Now, the manhunt intensified. Police knew his name, his face, and his methods, but catching him in a country torn apart by violence and mistrust proved far more difficult. By late 1995, the hunt for Moses Scythole had become one of the largest manhunts in South African history. His name and photograph were now known to police across the country, and the public lived in constant fear that he might strike again. Authorities had linked him to at least 38 murders, but whispers suggested the real number could be far higher, with estimates ranging between 70 and 100 victims. The walls began to close in when police traced phone calls Scythole had made to the families of victims, chilling taunts in which he hinted at his crimes or mocked their grief. These calls revealed both his arrogance and his desire for recognition, traits that ultimately betrayed him. In October 1995, investigators closed in on him in Johannesburg. When officers attempted to arrest him, Scythole resisted, producing a machete and injuring several before being shot and subdued. Even in capture, he radiated defiance, refusing to show remorse and boasting of his killings during interrogations. His trial the following year was one of the most high-profile in South African history, laying bare not only the brutality of his crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate for so long. Survivors testified about how he lured them with promises of jobs, leading them into isolated areas before attempting to strangle them. Families of victims sat through harrowing accounts, listening as prosecutors described the cold, methodical way Scythole targeted desperate women who only sought work to support themselves and their children. In December 1997, Moses Scythole was convicted of 38 murders, 40 rapes, and 6 robberies, receiving a sentence of 2,410 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 930 years. It was a sentence designed not merely to punish, but to symbolize the enormity of his crimes, a recognition that his place in society could never again be anything but a cage. For South Africa, still struggling through the fragile years of post-apartheid reconstruction, the case was a sobering reminder that evil could flourish even in times of hope, that predators could exploit trust and desperation to devastating effect. Sithole remains imprisoned to this day, his name largely unknown outside South Africa, but forever seared into the memory of those who lived through his reign of terror. And while his crimes turned open fields into graveyards, another unheard killer on the other side of Europe was creating her own cemetery, not in the countryside, but beneath her own home. Her name was Vera Renzi, and in the 1920s, she lured husbands and lovers into her cellar, and they never came back. In the 1920s, in a quiet town in what was then Yugoslavia, a wealthy and elegant woman lived in a grand house with a secret that would one day horrify the world. Her name was Vera Renzi, and to her neighbors she was the picture of sophistication. Beautiful, composed, and always impeccably dressed. To suitors she seemed irresistible, her dark eyes carrying a mysterious allure that drew men into her orbit. But behind the glamour and charm was a predator unlike any her community had ever known. Vera was not a drifter, nor a predator of strangers on the street. Instead, she brought death into her own home, feeding it to the men who trusted her most. Born in Bucharest in the late 1800s, she was said to have been spoiled and deeply possessive even as a child, craving control over those around her. After the early death of her mother, she grew up under the care of her wealthy father, who gave her every comfort. But beneath the refined upbringing, Vera developed an obsessive fear of abandonment, a fear that would transform into something far darker in adulthood. She married young to a wealthy man who became the first of many to meet a terrible fate. When she suspected he was unfaithful, she turned to poison, slipping arsenic into his wine until his health collapsed and his life ended. Neighbors pitied her, assuming she was a tragic widow. But Vera remarried, and again, when she sensed neglect or betrayal, her husband fell mysteriously ill, dying under her care. Soon a pattern emerged. Men entered her life with promises of love or marriage, but they rarely left. For years, Vera maintained an image of elegance while quietly cultivating a private cemetery in her own home. One by one, lovers, fiancés, and husbands disappeared, their bodies concealed not in distant fields, but in her own wine cellar, where she kept their remains in zinc-lined coffins. Each coffin was marked not publicly, but in her own obsessive cataloging, as though she were building a macabre collection of every man who had failed her. To the outside world, she was a grieving widow who simply had poor fortune in love. But inside the cellar of her mansion, Vera Renzi had created a museum of death, a gallery of betrayal turned permanent. Her obsession was not driven by financial gain alone, nor even by jealousy. It was control, the need to possess the men in her life completely, even in death. And for decades, she succeeded, her crimes hidden in plain sight beneath the floorboards of her beautiful home. For years, Vera Renzi's elegance and wealth shielded her from suspicion, even as men around her seemed to vanish without explanation. Neighbors whispered that she had simply been cursed with misfortune in love, a woman fated to lose husbands and lovers to sickness or bad luck. In small-town Europe of the 1920s, gossip rarely hardened into suspicion strong enough to pierce the veil of wealth and respectability. But slowly, the sheer number of disappearances surrounding her life grew impossible to ignore. Suitors who had once been seen entering her estate were never spotted leaving, their families receiving vague explanations that they had gone away on business or abandoned the relationship. Some relatives pressed for answers, but Vera, ever composed, would insist that her lovers had left her. painting herself as the wronged woman, once again abandoned. It was a performance she delivered with such conviction that many believed her. Yet rumors persisted, and eventually authorities began to take notice. When investigators probed her home, what they found in the wine cellar shattered any illusion of innocence. Beneath the elegance of her mansion, row upon row of zinc-lined coffins held the decomposing remains of men who had trusted her with their hearts, their lives, and often their fortunes. Some reports claim there were as many as 30 coffins, each containing a lover or husband whom Vera had poisoned with arsenic. The macabre discovery stunned even seasoned investigators, who struggled to comprehend not only the scale of the killings, but the eerie order with which she preserved her victims. Vera admitted to the crimes with unnerving calm, confessing that she had killed because she feared abandonment. Each man she loved, she claimed, had betrayed her in some way, with infidelity, neglect, or the simple failure to meet her expectations. Poison became her solution, a quiet and efficient weapon that left little trace in an era when forensic science was still developing. But more chilling than her method was her need to keep the bodies close. She had not buried them in secret fields or discarded them in rivers. She had kept them beneath her feet, as though their deaths were not the end of the relationship, but the beginning of a new form of possession. To Vera, the coffins were a way to ensure that the men she had loved would never truly leave her. Investigators, confronted with the rows of coffins, realized they were standing in a private mausoleum of obsession, one built not by grief, but by control. Vera's trial became a sensation in Eastern Europe, but outside the region, her name quickly faded from memory, eclipsed by louder, more public cases of male serial killers. Yet the cellar full of zinc coffins stood as one of the most grotesque symbols of intimate murder in history, a reminder that the deadliest threats often come not from strangers in the shadows, but from those seated across the dinner table, smiling, pouring wine, and hiding arsenic in every glass. The trial of Vera Renzi became the final act of a story that had stunned her community and horrified investigators, a tale of elegance hiding rot, of love transformed into possession. In court, prosecutors laid bare the truth of her crimes. The men she had lured with charm and beauty, the arsenic-laced meals that spelled their doom, and the zinc-lined coffins hidden in her cellar like a grotesque gallery of failed relationships. Witnesses described how family members had pressed her for answers when their sons or brothers vanished, only to be met with calm explanations that the men had abandoned her. Vera's poise in the courtroom was as chilling as her confessions. She admitted to the murders without visible remorse, explaining in a detached voice that her actions were driven not by greed alone, but by the fear of abandonment, a fear that had consumed her since childhood. The judge and jury listened as she described how each poisoning had given her a twisted sense of control, how preserving the bodies in her cellar meant the men would never leave her again. To many, her words sounded less like testimony and more like the diary of a woman who had long since abandoned the boundaries of sanity. The verdict was inevitable. Vera Renzi was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment, where she lived out her final years stripped of her wealth and elegance, confined to a cell rather than her grand estate. But even as her story faded from headlines, her crimes left behind a chilling legacy. The image of a wine cellar filled with coffins, each one a monument to obsession and control. In the decades since, her case has been overshadowed by louder, more sensational killers. But for those who remember, she remains one of the deadliest women in European history, a reminder that killers are not always drifters or strangers, but sometimes the ones who smile across the table, pouring wine laced with poison. And just as Vera's crimes revealed the horror that could hide behind wealth and refinement, across Germany in the 1970s, another figure showed how ruthlessness could grow in the shadows of poverty and neglect. His name was Fritz Honka, a reclusive drunk whose filthy apartment became the final resting place for women no one missed. Women whose remains lay hidden in squalor until fire exposed his secret. In the Hamburg of the 1970s, a city rebuilt from the ashes of war and known for its vibrant port and infamous red light district, an unassuming man lived quietly in a decrepit apartment that reeked of decay. His name was Fritz Honka, a short, disfigured man with a twisted nose, the result of childhood accidents and bar fights, whose appearance and reclusive habits kept him largely unnoticed in the busy St. Pauli district. To most, Honka was nothing more than a drunk who spent his evenings in smoky bars, slurring his way through drinks and occasionally leaving with women society had already forgotten. Sex workers, alcoholics, and drifters who lived on the edges of Hamburg's nightlife. But behind the walls of his squalid apartment, Honka hid a secret that would one day shock Germany. He was a predator who targeted the most vulnerable women he could find, luring them to his home with promises of alcohol or shelter, then killing them in drunken fits of rage. Unlike other killers who stalked their prey in the shadows, Honka's victims came willingly, seeking warmth, companionship, or simply escape from the cold streets. Once inside his filthy flat, they never left. Honka would strangle them, often during arguments fueled by alcohol, and then, rather than dispose of the bodies elsewhere, he kept them hidden in his apartment, stuffed in cupboards, behind walls, or under floorboards. The stench of decomposition seeped through the building, so overwhelming that neighbors complained, yet the foul odor was dismissed as the smell of Honka's unwashed lifestyle. For years, the bodies rotted in silence, while Honka carried on his life of anonymity, drinking in the same bars, stumbling home to the same decaying rooms, never drawing suspicion. His killings were not sophisticated or planned with precision. They were brutal, impulsive acts committed in moments of anger or desperation. But what made them horrifying was the banality, how easily they went unnoticed, how little attention society paid to the disappearances of marginalized women. To the city of Hamburg, Fritz Honka was invisible, a man not worth noticing. To his victims, he was death in human form, hiding behind a broken face and a bottle of cheap liquor. And for years, the horror he created was hidden in plain sight, sealed inside the walls of his crumbling apartment. By the mid-1970s, the stench that seeped from Fritz Honka's cramped apartment at 62 Zeissstrasse had grown so overwhelming that neighbors frequently complained, yet no one could imagine the source. In a building where poverty and neglect were the norm, foul smells were blamed on garbage, mold, or the tenants' poor hygiene. Honka himself was dismissed as a pitiful drunk, a man whose hunched frame and disfigured face made him seem more pathetic than dangerous. But behind his locked doors, the truth was rotting in silence. At least 4 women lay hidden within his walls and cupboards, their bodies dismembered or stuffed into makeshift concealments after being strangled in fits of alcohol-fueled rage. These women, most of them sex workers or transient alcoholics from Hamburg's Reeperbahn district, had slipped through the cracks of society so completely that their disappearances barely registered. To Honka, they were convenient prey, women no one looked for, women whose absence drew no police investigations, women he could kill and keep close without fear of discovery. For years, his crimes remained a secret, until July 2, 1975, when a fire broke out in the apartment building. As firefighters battled the flames and smoke poured into the night air, they made a grisly discovery. While searching through the wreckage of Honka's flat, they stumbled upon decomposed body parts hidden in trash bags and compartments. What had long been dismissed as the stench of a filthy drunk was suddenly revealed for what it truly was, the odor of death seeping out from a killer's lair. The firefighters' discovery shocked even hardened investigators who had never seen such a grotesque crime scene in the heart of Hamburg. Honka himself had fled the fire, but it did not take long for authorities to track him down. Under questioning, he confessed to the killings with little resistance, describing how he had lured the women home with alcohol, strangled them during arguments, and then kept their remains in his apartment. His casual explanation, that he did it when drunk and angry, horrified the public, not only because of the brutality, but because of how unnoticed it had gone for so long. Newspapers sensationalized the case, dubbing Honka the Monster of St. Pauli, a name that seemed almost absurd given his weak frame and pitiful appearance. Yet behind that broken exterior was a predator who had killed repeatedly, his crimes shielded by society's indifference to the most vulnerable. What haunted Hamburg most was not just the murders, but the realization that the city had walked past Honka daily, dismissing him as harmless, while he lived in a house of corpses. When Fritz Honka finally stood trial in 1976, Germany was forced to confront a predator who seemed on the surface too pitiful to commit such crimes, yet whose apartment had revealed horrors that defied imagination. In the courtroom, Honka appeared frail, stooped, and nervous, his crooked nose and hunched back giving him the appearance of a man beaten down by life rather than a calculating killer. But the evidence told another story, the remains of 4 women, all sex workers or alcoholics he had lured from bars in the Reeperbahn district to his filthy flat, only to strangle them during drunken rages. Investigators testified about the conditions inside his home, the stench of decay so powerful it lingered even after the fire, the bags of body parts, the crude attempts to conceal evidence in walls and cupboards. Honka did not deny the killings. Instead, he blamed alcohol, claiming he acted in blind fury when the women insulted him or resisted his advances. His defense argued diminished responsibility, pointing to his deformities, his lifelong alcoholism, and his social isolation. In the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, later reduced to 15 years in a psychiatric institution due to his mental instability. Honka lived out his days quietly in custody, dying in 1998 after a life spent in obscurity, punctuated only by the shocking revelations of his crimes. For Hamburg, the case left an enduring scar. It was not just the grotesque nature of the murders that horrified the public, but the way society had dismissed the disappearances of his victims. Because they were women on the margins, sex workers, heavy drinkers, transient souls, their vanishings were overlooked, their lives deemed unworthy of deeper investigation. Honka thrived in that neglect, hiding death in his own home while the world walked by without noticing. His story, like those of Moses Sithole in South Africa and Vera Renci in Eastern Europe, reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, shielded by indifference and invisibility. These were not killers who became infamous like Bundy or Dahmer, their names repeated in endless documentaries. These were predators nearly erased from memory, their crimes buried under the weight of history. And yet their stories, once uncovered, are perhaps the most haunting of all, because they prove that true ruthlessness does not need fame. It only needs silence. Evil doesn't always wear the mask we expect. Moses Sithole promised work but delivered death, leaving South Africa gripped in fear. Vera Renci turned love into obsession, filling her cellar with coffins of the men who trusted her. Fritz Honka hid his victims in the squalor of his apartment, their lives erased because no one bothered to look for them. 3 unheard names, 3 stories nearly lost to history, yet each a reminder that the most ruthless killers are often the ones forgotten. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments which of these left you unsettled.